Will you ever find yourself asking the question, is this all there is to life? Is this all there is to life? Perhaps that's a question that you're prompted to ask of yourself when you've had a really difficult day. Or perhaps it's a question you ask of yourself when you're in the middle of a really difficult season, much like the one we're in right now with the whole COVID-19 situation. Quite recently, be honest, I asked myself that question, is this really all there is to life? A number of months ago in January time, when I'm sure you all heard the tragic news of the death of a really world famous basketball player called Kobe Bryant. Here's a guy who's got everything going for him. He's famous, he's set world records, he's someone who's got loads of followers, all the money you could ever wish to have, and a great family, but just like that, in a freak accident in a helicopter crash, he and his 13-year-old daughter die. It's a tragic moment, and it prompts us to ask the question, is this really all there is to life? And of course the Bible's answer to that question is no, this is not all there is to life. In fact, there's so much more in store for you if you simply repent from your sin and put your trust and your faith in the Lord Jesus Christ. There is this eternal inheritance for you to enjoy, and so this life which you're currently experiencing is merely a speck on the grand timeline of your existence. That was the illustration, of course, used in a really famous video by Francis Chan, where he stood in front of his congregation and he got a massively long piece of rope. The rope was maybe about 20 to 30 meters long. And at one end of the rope, he attached about 2 to 3 inches of red tape. And as he looked at his congregation, he said this, I want you to imagine that this massively long piece of rope is a timeline of your existence. And then he pointed to the little red part, the 2 to 3 inches of red tape. He said, if this was a timeline of your existence, which should go on forever because you do exist forever, then this little red part would represent your time on earth. You have a few short years here on earth, and then comes all of eternity somewhere else. And he said it's crazy because we live in a world where everyone is consumed by this little red part. It's all they think about. Am I going to eat well? Am I going to sleep well? Am I going to have a nice retirement? Am I going to make loads of money? Am I going to get that career? And they completely neglect the millions and millions and millions of years that follow. But of course, as Christians, we hope not in the red part. We know that there's a far greater, eternal, imperishable kingdom waiting for us when we die because of Jesus Christ, as we rule with him and spend eternity with him forever and ever. And that's really the encouragement of Daniel chapter 2. We're reminded of this imperishable, eternal kingdom that Jesus Christ will inaugurate and that will spend with us for all of eternity. And I'm sure you're familiar with the first chapter of the book of Daniel. It's a really well-known book. The people of Israel have been exiled into Babylon. King Nebuchadnezzar is on the throne in Babylon. He's one of the most powerful men in the world. In fact, he's the most powerful man in the world. Put together some of the most famous people that you know, or the most powerful people that you know right now, the likes of the Queen or Donald Trump or King Jong-un. Put them all together and you're getting a little bit closer to the power that King Nebuchadnezzar holds. And the people of Israel now are being taken into Babylon in a number of different waves, exiled. And I want you to imagine just what that would be like for a few moments. Being separated from your families, not knowing if you're ever going to see your loved ones again, being forced to assimilate into a foreign pagan culture which is entirely unknown to you, probably living under very oppressive rule. That's the situation that the people of Judah find themselves in as they're brought into exile in Babylon. And of course in chapter 1 we were introduced to a guy called Daniel, a young guy, probably a teenager, him and his 3 friends. And they were enrolled in a special program put on by King Nebuchadnezzar, taking place in his palace. And of course, they were facing a number of challenges in that first chapter, challenges which made them perhaps tempted to compromise their faith. But they remained faithful to God, just as, more significantly, God remained faithful to them. He gave Daniel and his friends favor in the eyes of their commander. And at the end of that chapter, the friends and Daniel proved themselves to be 10 times better than everyone else enrolled on the program. And that's really what takes us up to chapter 2 of the book of Daniel, where we're picking up our story. And I want you to see 6 things in this chapter. We're not going to read the whole passage, it's quite a long one, but we will work through it as we go through these headings. So firstly, I want you to see an uninterpretable dream. An uninterpretable dream. Look with me from verses 1 through to 4. It says this, in the 2nd year of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar, Nebuchadnezzar had dreams. His spirit was troubled and his sleep left him. Then the king commanded that the magicians, the enchanters, the sorcerers, the Chaldeans be summoned to tell the king his dreams. So they came in and stood before the king. And the king said to them, I had a dream, and my spirit is troubled to know the dream. Then the Chaldeans said to the king in Aramaic, O king, live forever. Tell your servants the dream, and we will show the interpretation. King Nebuchadnezzar is about 30 years old at this point, and his power, as we said, is immeasurable. In fact, there's more space dedicated in the Bible to King Nebuchadnezzar than any other pagan king. That perhaps shows you, to some degree, the influence and the significance that he himself holds. But in verse 1, you can see that King Nebuchadnezzar's got a real problem. He's had this really disturbing dream, and he's desperate to find out what the dream means. Now, as you read that, you might think to yourself, oh, King Nebuchadnezzar, what's the big deal? You had a nightmare. We all have nightmares. It's no big deal. You just wake up and move on. Get on with your day. But you see, King Nebuchadnezzar is a pagan king, and he follows a false religion. One which really taught that your dreams were significant and were the means through which the gods spoke to you. And so King Nebuchadnezzar is desperate to find out the interpretation of this dream because he thinks that his gods are communicating to him through this dream. And of course you can tell that that's deeply ironic, because while the gods that King Nebuchadnezzar worships do not speak to him through his dreams, they're not real, the irony is that the true God, the God of the Bible, Yahweh, is communicating to Nebuchadnezzar through these dreams. And so King Nebuchadnezzar wakes up deeply disturbed about this dream. And so he brings in all the creme de la creme of Babylonian culture, all Satan's great agents, to try and figure out what this dream could possibly mean. Look who he brings in verse 2. He brings in the enchanters, the magicians, the sorcerers, the Chaldeans, all the best of Babylon to try and figure out what this dream means. But you see, King Nebuchadnezzar's got a problem. Not only does he want to know the interpretation of the dream, but he also needs to know the actual contents of the dream. It appears, at least to me, that King Nebuchadnezzar has actually forgotten what his dream was. I suppose there are two options here. Scholars are debated as to which one is the case. Either King Nebuchadnezzar has woken up and forgotten the contents of his dream, or else he actually does know the contents of his dream, but he's trying to test those who claim to be able to interpret it and withholding that piece of information from them. I think the former option is probably more likely, probably for two reasons. I think Nebuchadnezzar has forgotten his dream. Firstly, he's so desperate to have an interpretation, I don't think he would purposely withhold information, put another barrier in place to prevent it being interpreted. I think that's unlikely. But secondly, the Aramaic is quite key as well in this passage, and it says, the thing, or the dream, has been taken from me, or has been departed from me. And so I think what's going on here is that King Nebuchadnezzar has actually forgotten his dream. And so he needs these interpreters to do something supernatural. Not just tell me the interpretation of the dream, but actually tell me the contents of the dream as well as its interpretation. And these enchanters and sorcerers and all the creme de la creme of Babylon are quite concerned and really say in verse 4, this is really above our pay grade. Look what they say in verse 4. They say, O king, live forever. Tell your servants the dream, and we will show you the interpretation. If only you tell us what the dream is, King Nebuchadnezzar, we'll try our best and give you some sort of interpretation. But that's not good enough for King Nebuchadnezzar. And so firstly, you see an uninterpretable dream. But secondly then, notice the second point, an unforgiving punishment. An unforgiving punishment. I'm sure many of you, like me, have played plenty of Zoom table quizzes in recent weeks. It's about the only game you can play, a table quiz on Zoom. And perhaps one of the rounds that you played in one of those Zoom table quizzes was a round involving riddles. Riddles are something that I'm not very good at. Let me give you a couple of examples of some riddles. What has to be broken before it can be used? Can you get the answer to that? What has to be broken before it can be used? The answer is, of course, an egg. Or here's another one. What goes up but never comes down? The answer is, unfortunately, your age. Always goes up but never comes down. I'm not very good at riddles in Zoom quizzes. The pressure's always a bit too much. But I want you to imagine a different scenario, and that is you're given a riddle and you're being forced to find an interpretation, and someone's holding a gun to your head and says, if you do not find the interpretation of this riddle, I'm going to kill you. All of a sudden the pressure's ramped up significantly, hasn't it? And that's a position that these guys find themselves in verse 2, these enchanters and sorcerers and magicians and the creme de la creme of Babylon. Look what King Nebuchadnezzar says to them in verse 5. He says, the word from me is firm. If you do not make known to me the dream and its interpretation, you shall be torn from limb to limb, and your houses shall be laid in ruins. These Babylonians know that King Nebuchadnezzar is not in the business of making empty threats. In fact, he was known for following through with his harsh warnings, even against his own people, no matter how cruel they may be. And so these enchanters and sorcerers, all these divine agents of Satan, they really start to panic. And look what they say in verse 7. "O king," they plead with him, "just tell us what the dream was and we'll give you some interpretation." But of course that's no good to King Nebuchadnezzar, especially if he can't even remember the contents of his own dream. And to sum up how impossible this task which they've been given really is, look at what they say in verse 10, these enchanters and sorcerers and magicians. They say, "The king, there is not a man on earth who can meet the king's demands, for no great and powerful king has ever asked such a thing of any magician or enchanter or Chaldean." The heat is rising for these Chaldeans, for these creme de la creme of Babylon. They have no hope of being able to somehow tell this king his dream and interpret it as well. And so it seems pretty hopeless, and you can see yet again King Nebuchadnezzar issues his judgment in verse 12 and 13 by saying that every man will be killed in Babylon. They will be slaughtered, torn from limb to limb, if no interpretation to his dream can be found. This, of course, includes Daniel and his three friends. They're a part of the Babylonian system at this point. And so at this point in the narrative, things look about as bleak and as hopeless as they possibly could be. But isn't it ironic that even in verse 10, when these Chaldeans and these Babylonians and these people who are actually Satan's agents, when they express how impossible the task that they've been given really is, they actually put their finger right on the problem that they face. They've really pinpointed the real issue. Look what they said in verse 10. They said, "There is not a man on earth who can meet the king's demands." They're exactly right, aren't they? That is the problem. There is no man on earth who can meet the king's demands. He's asking something supernatural, something that only a supernatural being can truly make happen. And so they actually put their finger right on the money. This is the problem. That there is a reliance by King Nebuchadnezzar and all these people mentioned in the passage to find the answers seeking human wisdom only and not God's divine supernatural wisdom. They rely on human wisdom and not godly wisdom. And when you rely merely on human wisdom and not godly wisdom, it always leads to frustration and confusion and hopelessness. It's like what the Apostle Paul says in 1 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 19. He says, "Even the greatest wisdom in this world is like foolishness compared to God's wisdom." And so that prompts me to ask you the question, where in your life are you currently seeking human wisdom above godly wisdom? What predicament do you find yourself in, which also always just leads to frustration and confusion and disappointment because human wisdom can never compare to godly wisdom? Maybe it's in a particular broken relationship and you're trying to sort it out and you're putting your brains together and trying to make plans to make things right. But all the while you're completely neglecting God's wisdom. You never come before Him in prayer to talk to Him about the issue. Maybe it's in your plan making for the future. And you're trying to plan everything out as best you can and work a possible solution and get all your diary organized and things worked out from a human perspective. But you completely neglect looking to God for His wisdom. Because human wisdom alone will always lead you to confusion and helplessness. Or maybe it's in your evangelism. Maybe you've got particularly great opportunities at this moment in time to reach someone with the gospel message, and you slave over trying to present the gospel in a really helpful way that's tangible and helpful to them and will apply to their circumstance and their life. Yet you spend very little time praying to God, asking Him to reveal Himself to this individual, the one who truly brings light to darkness. And you rely on human wisdom as opposed to God's wisdom. That's the very error that King Nebuchadnezzar and the people in this passage find themselves falling into in this passage. An uninterpretable dream, an unforgiving punishment. Thirdly then, an unqualified prophet. An unqualified prophet. Look with me from verse 14 through to 18 as we continue through the narrative. It says this, "Then Daniel replied with prudence and discretion to Arioch, the captain of the king's guard, who had gone out to kill the wise men of Babylon. He declared to Arioch, the king's captain, 'Why is the decree of the king so urgent?' Then Arioch made the matter known to Daniel. And Daniel went in and requested the king to appoint him a time that he might show the interpretation to the king. Then Daniel went to his house and made the matter known to Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, his companions, and told them to seek mercy from the God of heaven concerning that mystery, so that Daniel and his companions might not be destroyed with the rest of the wise men in Babylon." This portion is absolutely astonishing. Keep in mind, Daniel at this point is a teenager, probably around 17 years old. And notice how God empowers Daniel to have such wisdom and boldness and courage. In fact, look what the text says in verse 14. It says that he acted with prudence and discretion. He even has the audacity to go into the presence of King Nebuchadnezzar and ask him for time for him, little Daniel, to try and find some sort of solution. Isn't that crazy? I mean, picture the scene. This is like a CEO of a global company, right? Imagine that. And someone like a Bill Gates or, a Donald Trump before he was the president, or a Sir Alan Sugar, someone like that. And he's got a big meeting with all his directors. And they're talking about the financial problems that their company is in. And they brought in all the experts, all the auditors, all the accountants, and no one can find a way forward. And they're just about to shut the doors because all the best brains in the game cannot figure out a way forward. And all of a sudden he gets a knock on his door, and in walks the 17-year-old guy who's only at the company that week on work experience. He's still at school. And imagine the audacity of that young student to say, hey guys, I know you can't find any solutions, but why don't you just give me a week? Let me try and sort it out. Wouldn't that be outrageous? Yet that's exactly what's going on here times 1,000. This isn't the CEO of a global company. This is the king. This is the guy who's the most powerful guy in the entire world. And what does Daniel ask King Nebuchadnezzar for? Time. More time. It's the very thing Nebuchadnezzar wasn't willing to give to the creme de la creme of Babylon. The smart guys, the intelligent guys. Yet that's the very thing that Daniel asks him for. And what's the one thing that Nebuchadnezzar actually does give Daniel? Time. For some strange reason, King Nebuchadnezzar agrees to let Daniel have time to go and find the solution. And you ask yourself, what's going on here? Why has King Nebuchadnezzar had a sudden change of heart? And here's the answer. The sovereign God is in control of every step of the story and every character within the story, even his own enemies, those whose hearts are furthest from him. Yet again, we see an example of God working through even the hearts of the pagans so that he can remain faithful to his people. This is what happened in chapter 1. God was working in and through the hearts of his enemies, and that's how Daniel was granted favor in the eyes of his pagan commander. And yet again now in chapter 2, God is working in and through the hearts of his enemies to bring about his purposes as he changes the heart of Nebuchadnezzar so that he can remain faithful to his people through Daniel and grant him more time. You see, this is the extent of God's sovereignty. He isn't just sovereign amongst his own people. He's sovereign even in the hearts of those whose hearts are furthest from him. Are you ever tempted to be fearful as you look out and see all the so-called powerful enemies of the gospel? Maybe it's the rise of militant Islam. Maybe it's the rise of secularism. Maybe it's the rise of these different campaigns who lobby against the likes of Christians for being so intolerant as they promote their very liberal agenda. Do you fear them? You shouldn't. Why? Because our God is so sovereign to the degree that he works in and through the hearts of even his enemies, those who are furthest from him. And that's exactly what we see here in this passage. God is the one who's able to accomplish his purposes in and through the hearts of people, even those who are furthest from him. God is the one who's moving all the pieces of the puzzle together in the background. And so far we've seen a number of things. We've seen an uninterpretable dream, verses 1 to 4. We've seen an unforgiving punishment, verses 5 through to 13. An unqualified prophet, verses 14 to 18. Fourthly then, notice an unlikely hero. An unlikely hero. It's an unbelievable breakthrough in the narrative, isn't it? And we see now that God grants Daniel the knowledge necessary to actually interpret the dream. Look what he says in verse 19. Verse 19, then the mystery was revealed to Daniel in a vision of the night. Then Daniel blessed the God of heaven. We can so easily take this part of the story for granted because we know it so well. But just take a few moments to really think about this today, that no wise man in Babylon, none of the greatest of Babylon were able to interpret this dream. Yet God was. He unveiled the contents and the interpretation of the dream. And not just that, he made it known to one of his servants, merely a 17-year-old boy. What a comfort this would be to those first hearers of the book of Daniel. Those exiled Israelites, as they were suffering, as they were in a dark place, they would be reminded, thank goodness, we have a God who's not only with us in the darkness, but we have a God who's able to do something about it. And so they, probably like Daniel does here, would be finding themselves bursting into praise. That's what Daniel does from verses 20 to 23. He sings a song of praise. And as he sings this song of praise, he makes no qualms about who the star of the show really is, who the hero of the story really is. It's God. That's why he refers time and time and time again in this little song of praise to God. He refers to God by saying God or he or you in every single line, because he wants us all to know that the one who deserves the glory, the one who brought this miracle about, wasn't him, but it was God. Look what he says. Verse 20, Daniel answered and said, "Blessed be the name of God forever and ever, to whom belong wisdom and might. He changes times and seasons. He removes kings and sets up kings. He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to those who have understanding. He reveals deep and hidden things. He knows what is in the darkness, and the light dwells with him. To you, O God of my fathers, I will give thanks and praise, for you have given me wisdom and might, and have made known to me what we have asked of you. For you have made known to us the king's matter." Daniel wants you to be under no illusions that God is the hero of this story. There's no exhortation in this passage to be like Daniel. There's no dare to be a Daniel. That's a myth. God is the one who deserves all the glory and brought about everything that happens in this passage. And Daniel wants to make sure that you and I are aware of that. And so he spends the time, even after his problem is solved, to praise his God. And quite often we can be very good, can't we, at being intense in our prayer and our praise of God when our problem remains unsolved. That's when we do most of our praying. Yet once God solves our problem, or once it resolves itself, we're very hesitant or very slow or very minimal in coming back to him in praise and adoration. But that's not the case with Daniel. He spends time to ensure that God gets all of the glory, and not just then, but when he actually approaches King Nebuchadnezzar to give him the answer, even then he wants to be sure that God receives all of the glory. Look what he says in verse 27. He says, "No wise man, enchanter, magician, or astrologer can show the king the mystery that the king has asked." But then what he says in verse 28, "But there is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries." Wouldn't it have been really tempting for Daniel at that point, as he was coming before Nebuchadnezzar, just to take a bit of the glory himself, even just a little bit? I mean, this is the king. No other wise man was able to solve his problem, but I've got the solution. This is the person you want to butter yourself up to. The king, he could give you a healthy promotion. He could take care of you for the rest of your life. In fact, this king, remember, he's a pagan king. In fact, you might even spoil this good news if you tell him that it was the God of the Bible who gave it to you, because he might be offended. This might ruin everything. But Daniel doesn't care. He wants even King Nebuchadnezzar, one of God's own enemies, to know that God was the source of wisdom and God was the one who made this wrong right. And so look what he says yet again in verse 30. "But as for me, this mystery has been revealed to me, not because of any wisdom that I have more than all of the living." An uninterpretable dream, an unforgiving punishment, an unqualified prophet, an unlikely hero. Notice then, fifthly, an unveiled explanation. Daniel starts to tell King Nebuchadnezzar the contents of his dream. You can see in verse 31 that he says, this dream involved a large image or a large statue. And this large statue was made up of a number of different parts. Verse 32, it had a head of gold, it had a chest and arms made of silver, then in the middle its thighs were bronze, legs of iron, and then feet of clay. Really strange imagery. But the picture gets even stranger in verse 34. We see that the stone emerges. And there's nothing unique about the stone. In fact, notice a really important phrase in verse 34, which says it was cut by no human hand. But as the stone strikes the statue, it falls to pieces, and then it becomes this great mountain. I think we can all agree that's a very strange dream that King Nebuchadnezzar has, and maybe there was a picture of confusion on his face as Daniel recounted this dream to him. But in verse 36 to 45, Daniel then gives the interpretation of the dream. Because remember, King Nebuchadnezzar didn't just need someone who could tell him the contents of the dream, but its interpretation also. And so it starts on a really positive note. He says, "King Nebuchadnezzar, that head of gold, that's you. You and the Babylonians, your kingdom right now, which is on top of the world, you're top of the tree, you are great and powerful right now." And you can probably imagine King Nebuchadnezzar feeling very important and very, very good about himself at this point. But the story begins to get a little less positive for Nebuchadnezzar as the interpretation continues in verse 39. Daniel says, "But one day your kingdom will be superseded by another inferior kingdom. But then that inferior kingdom, who's now top of the tree, will be then superseded by another kingdom. And this is going to be the pattern throughout the foreseeable future. One kingdom is going to be superseded by another kingdom, which will one day be superseded by another kingdom, which will one day be superseded by another kingdom. And of course, as we look back in history, we can see that those empires are quite commonly identified as, firstly, Babylon. It was the head of gold, which was superseded by the Medes and the Persians, which were then superseded by the Greeks, who were then superseded by the Romans. But don't forget the very important imagery in verse 34 about the stone. And so this little stone emerges into the picture. And remember, it's a stone which is a very subtle, very humble entrance into this vision. Doesn't make a very grand entrance. Remember verse 34, not made by human hands. Unlike all the other world leaders and empires. This one makes a very humble beginning, yet it begins to grow and grow and grow as the statue, after being hit by the stone, is torn into smithereens. And of course, this stone is a reference to Jesus Christ and his imperishable, indestructible kingdom. Jesus came not by human hands, by means of a virgin birth, immaculate conception. Jesus, just like the stone, had very humble beginnings. He came in a very small way. He was born in a stable in Bethlehem. Yet just as his kingdom started like a mustard seed, it would grow and grow and grow and expand and take over the entire world. And that's exactly what we see. Verse 44, it's a kingdom that will not be destroyed, a kingdom that will stand forever. It's the kingdom of God. God's kingdom which is unshakable and immovable and steadfast. Do you know, we live in a day and age right now where things are uncertain. Everything's uncertain. There are very few things you can point at right now and say, that is steadfast. There's very few jobs you can look at and say, that's a secure job. There are very few businesses you can look at and say, that's a secure business. There are very few churches or even countries you can look at and say, that is a secure country. Everything's insecure right now. But you know the one thing that is secure and steadfast and will not be shaken? Do you know the one thing that will be here in 10 years, 100 years, 1,000 years, even 1,000,000 years? It's God's kingdom. Because God's kingdom is indestructible, it is steadfast, it will not be moved. It, unlike all the other kingdoms, will never be superseded by anyone or anything. And so here's a question I'm prompted to ask you this morning, this evening. It's this. How does your diary need to reflect, and how does your energy and investment need to reflect that God's kingdom, unlike any other endeavor we may pursue, is indestructible, it's steadfast, it cannot be moved? Where do you find yourself investing all your energy, all your enterprise, all your money, all your time, all your effort into other ventures, which are good things, but do not deserve your undying allegiance? Why? Because they, unlike the kingdom of God, will one day pass and will one day spoil and will one day fade. It's like the Apostle Paul says in the end of 1 Corinthians chapter 9. He says, as we run this race of life and as we seek first the kingdom, we do not waste our time. We're doing and putting our time to good use, because we will receive an imperishable wreath, an imperishable reward, unlike all the other endeavors which we find ourselves pursuing in this life, which ultimately will give way and ultimately will fade. And so how do you need to rearrange your priorities this week? How do you need to rearrange your money this week? How do you need to rearrange your time this week to maybe reflect more the imperishable nature of the kingdom of God? And so in this chapter we see an uninterpretable dream, an unforgiving punishment, an unqualified prophet, an unlikely hero, an unveiled explanation, but sixthly and finally and really briefly, notice an unimaginable reward. Look with me from verse 46 to 49. It says, then King Nebuchadnezzar fell upon his face and paid homage to Daniel and commanded that an offering of incense be offered up to him. The king answered and said to Daniel, truly your God of gods is the Lord of kings and a revealer of mysteries, for you have been able to reveal this mystery. Then the king gave Daniel high honours and made many great gifts, and made him ruler over the whole province of Babylon and chief prefect over all the wise men of Babylon. Daniel made a request of the king, and he appointed Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego over the affairs of the province of Babylon. But Daniel remained at the king's court. We shouldn't miss the significance of verse 46, where King Nebuchadnezzar literally falls on his face and pays homage to little Daniel and his God. That's a staggering image. Don't let that be lost on you. Imagine one of the world rulers in today's age, someone like a Kim Jong-un, falling to his face in front of a 17-year-old Christian to pay homage to his God. That's literally unheard of. And not only that, it leads to these confessions of praise in verse 47. From Nebuchadnezzar, a pagan king, now confessing with his mouth that the true God is the God of the Bible. And it's interesting, as you look at this chapter in Daniel, it really follows the exact same pattern as all the early chapters of Daniel. Here's what the pattern goes like. Daniel, God's servant, is brought low. He's then brought, God's servant, face to face with judgment. But through God's empowering work, he spares the masses from judgment. That leads to God's servant Daniel being elevated to a position of authority, and even the pagan authorities proclaiming that God really is God with their lips. And as you hear that pattern that takes place not just in this chapter but in all the early chapters of Daniel, it should remind you of something. It should remind you of the greater story of the Bible. God's greater redemptive plan. These little chapters are almost like a prototype to the great story of the Bible, God's redemptive plan, where God's servant, not Daniel, but Jesus, is brought low. God's servant, not Daniel, but Jesus, comes face to face with judgment. Yet through God's empowering, God's servant, not Daniel, but Jesus, spares the mass from judgment. He is then subsequently elevated to a position of authority as he sits at God's right hand, and it leads to all the pagans and all the rulers falling to their face and confessing that Jesus is Lord. As we see in Philippians chapter 2, one day every knee will bow and every tongue will confess that Jesus is the Christ. And so this passage points you forward to God's greater redemptive work. And so as you reflect on this chapter 2 of the book of Daniel, it should really speak to you on a number of different levels. Firstly, it should speak to you in the same way that it spoke to these first hearers of the book, these exiled Israelites, and the encouragement that it would bring to them, in spite of the fact that life is tough and that we feel oppression, that there really is more than this. God is with us in the midst of our oppression, but he's also going to inaugurate his eternal, imperishable kingdom that will not spoil, that will not fail, that will not be superseded by any earthly oppressive empire. And so there's hope. But at another, more deeper level, this passage should encourage us in a way that it couldn't even encourage those first hearers. Now that we live at this side of the cross and we see the full picture of God's redemptive plan, we should be encouraged by the fact that this points to a greater rescue story, a rescue story where many would be spared from judgment, as God's servant came face to face with judgment and is subsequently elevated, leading to the confession of praise from even the highest and mighty of our world. Not Daniel, but Jesus Christ.